This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Greylorn by Keith Laumer. Section 3. Step by step the magnification was increased as ring after ring of the lens antennae were thrown into play. Each time the centering operation was more delicate. The image grew until it filled a quarter of the screen. We stared at it in fascination. It showed up in stark silhouette in the electronic light of the radar scope. Two perfect discs, joined by a fine filament. As we watched, their relative positions slowly shifted, one moving across, half occluding the other. As the image drifted, Miller worked with infinite care at his console to hold it on center, in sharp focus. "Wish you'd give me an orbit on this thing, Joyce," he said, "so I could lock on to it." "It ain't got no orbit, man," Joyce said. "I'm tracking it, but I don't understand it. That rock is on a closing curve with us, and slowing down fast." "What's the velocity, Joyce?" I asked. "Averaging about 1,000 relative, Captain, but slowing fast." "All right, we'll hold our course," I said. I keyed for a general announcement. "This is the captain," I said. "General quarters. Man action stations and prepare for possible contact within 1 hour. Missile section, arm number 1 battery and stand by." Then I added, "We don't know what we've got here, but it's not a natural body. Could be anything from a torpedo on up." I went back to the beam screen. The image was clear, but without detail. The two discs slowly drew apart, then closed again. "I'd guess that movement is due to rotation of two spheres around a common center," Clay said. "I agree with you," I said. "Try to get me a reading on the mass of the object." I wondered whether Kramer had been locked up as I had ordered, but at this moment it seemed unimportant. If this was, as I hoped, a contact with our colony, all our troubles were over. The object, I hesitated to call it a ship, approached steadily, still decelerating. Now Clay picked it up on the televideo as it paralleled our course 4,500 miles out. "Captain, it's my guess the body will match speeds with us at about 200 miles at his present rate of deceleration," Clay said. "Hold everything you've got on him, and watch closely for anything that might be a missile," I said. Clay worked steadily over his chart table. Finally he turned to me. "Captain, I get a figure of over 100 million tons mass, and calibrating the scope images gives me a length of nearly 2 miles." I let that sink in. I had a strong and very empty feeling that this ship, if ship it were, was not an envoy from any human colony. The annunciator hummed and spoke. "Captain, I'm getting a very short wave transmission from a point out on the starboard bow. Does that sound like your torpedo?" It was Mannion. "That's it, Mannion," I said. "Can you make anything of it?" "No, sir," he answered. "I'm taping it so I can go to work on it." Mannion was our language and code man. I hoped he was good. "What does it sound like?" I asked. "Tune me in." After a moment a high hum came from the speaker. Through it I could hear harsh chopping consonants, a whining intonation. I doubted that Mannion would be able to make anything out of that gargle. Our bogey closed steadily. At 425 miles he reversed relative directions, and began matching our speed, moving closer to our course. There was no doubt he planned to parallel us. I made a brief announcement to all hands describing the status of the action. Clay worked over his televideo, trying to clear the image. I watched as the blob on the screen swelled and flickered. Suddenly it flashed into clear, stark definition. Against a background of sparkling black, the twin spheres gleamed faintly in reflected starlight. There were no visible surface features. The iodine-colored forms and their connecting shaft had an ancient and alien look. We held our course steadily, watching the stranger maneuver. Even at this distance it looked huge. "Captain," Clade said, "I've been making a few rough calculations. The two spheres are about 800 yards in diameter, and at the rate the structure is rotating it's pulling about 6 gravities." That settled the question of human origin of the ship. No human crew would choose to work under 6 Gs. Now, paralleling us at just over 200 miles, the giant ship spun along, at rest relative to us. It was visible now through the direct observation panel, without magnification. I left Clay in charge on the bridge, and I went down to the comm section. Joyce sat at his board, reading instruments and keying controls. So he was back on the job. Mannion sat, head bent, monitoring his recorder. The room was filled with the keening staccato of the alien transmission. "Got anything on video?" I asked. Joyce shook his head. "Nothing, Captain. I've checked the whole spectrum, and this is all I get. It's coming in on about a dozen different frequencies. No FM." "Any progress, Mannion?" I said. He took off his headset. "It's the same thing, repeated over and over, just a short phrase. I'd have better luck if they'd vary it a little." "Try sending," I said. Joyce tuned the clatter down to a faint clicking, and switched his transmitter on. "You're on, Captain," he said. "This is Captain Greylorn, UNACV Galahad. Kindly identify yourself." I repeated this slowly, half a dozen times. It occurred to me that this was the first known time in history a human being had addressed a non-human intelligence. The last was a guess, but I couldn't interpret our guest's purposeful maneuverings as other than intelligent. I checked with the bridge. No change. Suddenly the clatter stopped, leaving only the carrier hum. "Can't you tune that whine out, Joyce?" I asked. "No, sir," he replied. "That's a very noisy transmission. Sounds like maybe their equipment is on the blink." We listened to the hum, waiting. Then the clatter began again. "This is different," Mannion said. "It's longer." I went back to the bridge, and waited for the next move from the stranger, or for word from Mannion. Every half hour I transmitted a call identifying us, followed by a sample of our language. I gave them English, Russian, and standard interlingua. I didn't know why, but somehow I had a faint hope they might understand some of it. I stayed on the bridge when the watch changed. I had some food sent up, and slept a few hours on the OD's bunk. Fine replaced Kramer on his watch when it rolled around. Apparently Kramer was out of circulation. At this point I did not feel inclined to pursue the point. We had been at general quarters for 21 hours when the wall annunciator hummed. "Captain, this is Mannion. I've busted it." "I'll be right there," I said, and left at a run. Mannion was writing as I entered comm section. He stopped his recorder and offered me a sheet. "This is what I've got so far, Captain," he said. I read, "Invader, the Mancji presence opens communications." "That's a highly inflected version of early interlingua, Captain," Mannion said. "After I taped it, I compensated it to take out the rise and fall tone, and then filtered out the static. There were a few sound substitutions to figure out, but I finally caught on. It still doesn't make much sense, but that's what it says." "I wonder what we're invading," I said. "And what is the Mancji presence?" "They just repeat that over and over," Mannion said. "They don't answer our call." "Try translating into old interlingua, adding their sound changes, and then feeding their own rise and fall routine to it," I said. "Maybe that will get a response." I waited while Mannion worked out the message, then taped it on top of their whining tone pattern. "Put plenty of horsepower behind it," I said. "If their receivers are as shaky as their transmitter, they might not be hearing us." We sent for 5 minutes, then tuned them back in and waited.